So that's it for our admittedly very brief and truncated summary of Roman history. Now let's move on to Rome's cultural contributions in the areas of philosophy and literature, which form the basis of Ancient Rome Part 2. So, what were Rome's contributions to philosophy? Well, in order to answer that question, it's important to remember that the Romans were highly influenced by the Greeks, particularly the major Greek philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So, a large part of their contribution to the discipline of philosophy was simply to preserve and translate and pass on the work of Greek philosophers. It's also important to realize that while the Romans loved and respected Greek culture, they were fundamentally a more practical people than the Greeks. They were much more interested in problem solving and figuring out basic rules for living. So their approach to philosophy was more about helping people cope with the travails and difficulties of life in the real world than it was about speculative endeavors such as unraveling the mystery of existence or describing the limits of human knowledge, and so on. In this respect, the Romans are a little bit more like the Chinese Confucians than they are the ancient Greeks. So, for this reason, the Romans were particularly interested in two schools of philosophical thought from the Hellenistic period. In other words, the period from Alexander the Great going forward, that seem to share their pragmatic emphasis. The first would be hedonism, and the second would be Epicureanism. So let's talk about hedonism first. Hedonism was a philosophical school founded by Aristippus of Cyrene, who lived from 435 to 356 BCE. He was a student of Socrates. Because this school is associated with Aristippus, it's also sometimes called the Cyrenaic school because he's from Cyrene. The hedonists taught, essentially, that pleasure is the only good, and the happiest man is the one who has the most pleasures. Moreover, they equated pleasure not just with the absence of pain, but with momentary pleasurable sensations. They also denied that there was any fundamental distinction between different kinds of pleasure, whereas Socrates had praised the higher pleasures of the mind, the intellect, like reading a good book or learning philosophy. The hedonists said that bodily pleasures, like food and sex and full belly, a good nap, were preferable because they were more simple and more intense. It's important to understand that part of the reason why the hedonists put such an emphasis on momentary bodily pleasures is not just because they liked pleasure in and of itself, but also because they had a particular theory of knowledge. Essentially, they held that all knowledge consists of immediate sensory experience. We can know that we're having an immediate sensory experience. In other words, like, let's say I put a piece of candy in my mouth, I have a sweet taste in my mouth. But we can know nothing about the object or objects presumed to cause that sensation. Like the piece of candy or whatever else I might have put in my mouth to cause that sensation. And since sensory experience is the only true form of knowledge, it follows that we should fill our lives with as much pleasurable sensory experience as possible. In other words, as much food, wine, sex, and so on. Because that's how we learn. And just as a sidebar, one funny story about Aristippus and how he implemented this idea in his own life is that one night he was staying at the palace of King Dionysius of Syracuse, who decided to honor him by giving him a choice of 3 courtesans, in other words, royal prostitutes, to spend the night with him. Basically, the king brought out these 3 women, and he said, "You choose." And Aristippus promptly chose all three. And when asked why, when the king asked him why, Aristippus replied, "Well, Paris of Troy once had to choose between three different women, and look what trouble that caused." um, so he's comparing himself to Paris of Troy. He said, I'm not going to choose. I'm not going to make a choice. I'm just going to take all three." Um, and despite its initial popularity, hedonism mostly died out by the mid 4th century BCE and was replaced by a new Hellenistic school of philosophy called Epicureanism. Epicureanism. Epicureanism was a philosophical school associated with Epicurus, who lived from 341 to 270 BCE. Now, there's a lot of overlap between hedonism and Epicureanism. They share some similar values, but they're not exactly the same thing. Like the hedonists, Epicurus taught that pleasure is the only good, and the happiest man is the one who has the most pleasures. Unlike the hedonists, however, Epicurus maintained that this did not mean that you should go all out in seeking any particular type of pleasure, like, drinking, using drugs, having lots of sex, and so on, because that would lead to pain in other areas of your life that would counteract whatever pleasure you attained. So, yes, pleasure is the only good, and the happiest man is the one who has the most pleasures, but don't go whole hog into seeking physical pleasures as much as you possibly can, because if you overdo it in the long run, that's going to counteract the goal. So the road to happiness, therefore, according to Epicurus, was to embrace moderation in all things. Moderation in all things. In other words, drink, but don't drink too much. Don't become an alcoholic. Eat, but don't become a glutton. Because by moderating your pleasures, you can enjoy all of them to the fullest extent. And then there's another school, another philosophical school of thought associated with the Hellenistic period that's also very influential for the ancient Romans, and that's Stoicism. Now, this is a school of thought associated with Zeno of Citium. In essence, Stoicism holds that the world around us operates according to a web of cause and effect. Stoicism holds that the world around us operates according to a web of cause and effect, resulting in a rational structure to the universe that the Stoics called logos, or word. And while we cannot always anticipate or understand, much less control what happens to us, we can control how we respond to it. So rather than trying to imagine an ideal society, like Plato's Republic, the Stoic says that we must accept the world as it is, while controlling the one thing that we can control, ourselves. Hence, Stoicism emphasized the importance of self-improvement by cultivating four cardinal virtues. Four cardinal virtues. And they were wisdom, temperance, justice, and courage. Wisdom is the ability to deal with the complexities of life in a calm and rational manner. Temperance is the exercise of moderation and restraint in all aspects of life. In this respect, the Stoics are very similar to the Epicureans, because they both place a high value on temperance. Justice, treating others fairly and equitably, even if they've wronged you or insulted you. And lastly, courage, which the Stoics defined as the ability to face both extreme circumstances and daily life with calmness and integrity, to live according to the principles you believe in, even when the circumstances that you face might challenge you to abandon them. The Roman Stoic Seneca probably best expressed this idea when he wrote, "Sometimes even to live is an act of courage." Sometimes even to live is an act of courage. The emphasis on self-improvement, however, did not mean that Stoic philosophy was completely focused on the self. Far from it. Because part of accepting the world as it is meant learning to accept your place in it. So, if you were born a slave, be a good slave. Be the best slave that you can possibly be. Serve your master faithfully and with enthusiasm. If you were a merchant, be the best merchant you can be. Be hardworking, be industrious, also be honest. Don't cheat your customers. If you are born an emperor, well, be the wisest and fairest and most beneficent emperor that you could possibly be. Now, of these different Hellenistic schools of philosophy, the Romans were interested in all of them. But the one that had the most impact on them, and also the one that they contributed the most to, although it doesn't start with them, it starts with the Greeks, but the one that the Romans contribute the most to was Stoicism. All right? Stoicism profoundly influenced some of Rome's greatest minds, including the Roman orator and writer and politician Cicero, Epictetus, Seneca, and also some of its greatest rulers, including the emperor Marcus Aurelius. Now, Marcus Aurelius was probably the most famous Stoic statesman of ancient Rome. He wrote a famous book called The Meditations, and it's a very interesting book in that, whereas most people write a book, intending it for a wide distribution, in other words, try and get as many readers as you possibly can, Marcus Aurelius wasn't really interested in that. He wrote Meditations as a book to himself. It was not intended for anyone else to see at all. Why? Well, that question is a little bit difficult to answer, but probably because Marcus Aurelius, in his day-to-day life, was a very lonely man. He was the absolute ruler of the greatest empire in the world, with the power of life and death over millions of people. But everyone who came to see him wanted something from him. Now, as a Stoic, he believed it was his responsibility to do right by his subjects. But he had no peers or equals to confide in, and the weariness of it got to him after a while. So he wrote Meditations as a kind of inner dialogue. It was kind of like his journal, an inner dialogue to check himself and see if he was living according to his own Stoic principles. So Meditations is filled with moral maxims meant to prod himself to be a better person. Like, soon you will have forgotten the world, and the world will have forgotten you. In other words, don't get angry when people fail you or disappoint you, because soon you'll be dead and it won't matter. And soon they'll be dead and they won't remember you at all. Which is a remarkable thing for the most powerful man in the world to say to himself. All men are made for one another. Either then teach them better or bear with them. In other words, you're going to have to live with human beings no matter what. So either help them learn how to overcome their own failings or learn to put up with them. And again, this is a kind of remarkable thing for the most powerful man in the world to say to himself. I have to put up with people even when they disappoint me, even when their deeds don't live up to my expectations. This is somebody who could very easily get rid of anybody who displeased him. But he says, no, I'm going to try and teach them to learn to be better. or I'm going to put up with them, put up with their failings as best I can. Change your opinion whenever anyone at hand sets you right and unsettles you in an opinion. But this change of opinion should come only because you are persuaded, not because it appears pleasant or increases your reputation. In other words, be willing to listen to other people because you don't know everything and you might be wrong, but only adopt an opinion or only change your opinion because you truly believe that the change is right, not because it makes other people like you. Don't change your opinion just to make other people like you, which again is, Marcus Aurelius is basically a politician, even though he's a ruler. So the happiness or contentedness of his subjects does matter to him, at least to some degree, because it determines how secure his rule is going to be. But he's saying, I'm in this position to do people good, not necessarily to win a popularity contest. This is an idea that I think a lot of our politicians today could probably benefit from considering. So, as we've seen in philosophy, the Romans were building mainly upon a foundation established by the Greeks. They made significant contributions in the part of the discipline that I would call practical philosophy. In other words, applying philosophical principles to real-world problems. Likewise, their efforts in the areas of literature and oratory were highly pragmatic in focus. So some of the best known examples include they contributed the first known encyclopedia, Naturalis Historia, or Natural History, published by the Roman author Pliny the Elder in the 1st century BCE. Also the first known biographical work, Excellentium Imperatorum Vitae, or Lives of Outstanding Generals, published by the Roman historian Cornelius Nepos in 44 CE, followed shortly thereafter by Plutarch's more famous work, Lives of Noble Romans and Greeks, in 80 CE, more commonly called simply Plutarch's Lives. They made significant contributions to the discipline of history. The best example of this would probably be the Roman historian Titus Livius, also known as Livy for short. He's probably the greatest Roman historian. Most of his works no longer survive, but one of the few that does is his History of Rome, which traced the history of Rome from the founding of the city, supposedly in the 8th century BCE, although the exact founding date is up to debate, all the way to Livy's own day in the 1st century CE. This is still considered to be one of the best historical sources on early Roman history. Although Livy and other Roman historians tended to write to reinforce Roman patriotism, they also generally paid closer attention to historical detail. They were more exacting in their analysis of the sources than their Greek predecessors. So, methodologically speaking, you could argue that they were better historians. Lastly, although the Romans did not exactly invent the discipline of oratory, in other words, the art of public speaking, they were masters of that art. The Romans placed a high priority on oratory in their educational system, particularly for the patrician class, the upper class. Virtually all upper class youths were trained in the art of public speaking. To be a good public speaker was considered to be a major part of what it meant essentially to be a gentleman or a patrician, a member of the patrician class. And this is in part because in an empire as sprawling and diverse as Rome's was, the ability to speak persuasively to large numbers of people was an absolute must, particularly if you're going to be involved in politics. Probably the greatest Roman orator was Cicero. Um, he was a politician. At one point, he held the position of consul of Rome, so he was one of those, one of those two chief executives of the Roman Republic. He's also a prolific writer. He wrote around 100 speeches and essays. Late in life, he became a political opponent of Julius Caesar due to Caesar's power-grabbing ways. And after Caesar's death, he became implicated in the assassination plot. And when Caesar's allies retook control of the Roman Republic, he was executed for his alleged involvement in the plot to kill Caesar. Now, as you might expect, much of Cicero's oratory dwelt on such themes as patriotism, statesmanship, and the duties of citizens and public servants to their country. So a good example of this would be Cicero's treatise On Duty. On Duty was the title of it, in which he says this. He says, "It is a statesman's duty, then, to endanger our own rather than the public welfare, and to hazard honor and glory more readily than other advantages." In other words, if you're a politician, do what's best for your country rather than for yourself, and do it regardless of whether you're praised for it, because honor and glory are ultimately meaningless. Also from On the Republic, for our country did not give us life and nurture unconditionally. No, it reserved the right to appropriate for its own purpose the largest and most numerous portions of our loyalty, ability, and sagacity, leaving to us for our private use only what might be surplus to its needs. In other words, we owe it to our country, which has nurtured us and raised us, to serve its needs above our own, to serve our country's needs above our own, which is an idea that in the modern 21st century context is often referred to as civic virtue. A number of the United States own most revered founding fathers put a high value or emphasis on that idea. Finally, Rome's finest literary contributions probably came in the area of poetry. Now, as is the case with oratory, much of ancient Rome's finest verse dealt with such topics as war, patriotism, and also man's relationship to the state. The best example of this is probably the famous Roman poet Virgil. Now, I have a video here in the PowerPoint, which it's a short video, only a few minutes in length, which all of you would be well advised to listen to. But I'm going to basically sort of recap what the video says here. Virgil, again, he's Rome's most famous poet, and his most famous composition is the Aeneid. What was the Aeneid? Well, it was an epic poem modeled very much after Homer's Iliad. Like the Iliad, for example, it was written in dactylic hexameter. Again, the Romans loved to copy everything Greek. And the Aeneid told the story of the founding of Rome, a highly mythologized version of that story, that is. And it tells the story of Aeneas, a Trojan leader, the son of Anchises and Aphrodite. So he's a demigod, part man, part god. And he leaves Troy after its fall after the Greeks capture and loot and destroy the city. And he ends up traveling the Mediterranean looking for a new home for the Trojan people. In several places, Virgil obviously invites readers to make comparisons between Aeneas and Augustus, aka Octavian, who was Julius Caesar's successor and the emperor at the time that Virgil is living. And what this shows us is that while Greek poetry transmitted values, Virgil and other Roman poets were just as interested, if not more interested, in trying to use poetry to boost patriotism and loyalty to the state and the emperor. However, there are several passages in the Aeneid which implicitly critique Aeneas, and therefore also sort of implicitly critique the emperor as well, although Virgil is very circumspect in doing so, not surprisingly, given the political context. Not all of Roman poetry, however, was devoted to weighty political matters. The Romans also pioneered the use of satirical poetry, using verse to mock and or ridicule things that they found to be foolish or ridiculous or silly or offensive. Now, they were limited in what they could mock, of course, because after all, if you turn your pen against the emperor, you're likely to get rewarded with a nice prison cell or worse. So instead of using satirical poetry to go after political figures, although that does happen from time to time, much of their satire was devoted to such topics as love and lust and relationships with the opposite sex, and so on. A great example of this is Horace's To Be Quite Frank, the Roman poet Horace's poem To Be Quite Frank, which pokes fun at a middle-aged woman who insists on behaving like a young teenage girl. I'll read you a selection from it. Your conduct, naughty Chloris, is not just exactly Horace's ideal of a lady at the shady time of life. You mustn't throw your soul away on foolishness like Philoe. Her days are folly laden. She's a maiden. You're a wife. In other words, he's mocking this woman, Chloris, for behaving like a woman many years her junior. In other words, the implicit message is grow up, lady. Stop, parading around like a teenager. Stop dressing like a teenager. Stop acting like a young girl. Now, Horace's poem was indicative of another aspect of Roman poetry and also of Roman society generally speaking, that many modern people would find uncomfortable or even offensive. And that is Roman misogyny. Like the Greeks, Romans viewed women as the moral and intellectual inferiors of men. And Roman poets could be quite vicious in expressing this sentiment. Another good example would be Juvenal's poem Against Women. It's titled Against Women, which reads in part, there's nothing a woman won't do, nothing she thinks is disgraceful. With the green gems at her neck or pearls distending from her earlobe, there's nothing is worse to endure than your Miss Rich Bitch, whose visage is padded and plastered with dough in the most ridiculous manner. Furthermore, she reeks of unguents, so God help her husband, with his wretched face dunk up with these, smeared by her lipstick. To her lover she comes with her skin washed clean, but at home, why does she need to look pretty? Nard is assumed for the lover. For the lover she buys all the Arabian perfumes. It takes her some time to strip down to her face, removing the layers. Now, to be fair to Juvenal, he didn't just write about women. He was also one of the bolder poets in Roman history. He was somebody who would actually write satirical poems mocking the flaws he saw in Roman society, politics, and the government. So, for example, Juvenal actually wrote a poem titled Against the City of Rome, literally against the city of Rome. Why should I go? What should I do in Rome? I'm no good at lying. If a book's bad, I can't praise it or go around ordering copies. I don't know the stars. I can't hire out as an assassin. When some young man wants his father knocked off for a price, I have never uh, studied the guts of frogs, and plenty of others know better how to convey to a bride the gifts of the first man she cheats with. I'm no lookout for thieves, so I cannot expect a commission on some governor's staff. I'm a useless corpse or a cripple who has a pull these days except your yes men and stooges with blackmail in their hearts, yet smart enough to keep silent. In other words, he's basically saying Rome is a place for thieves, murderers, assassins, and corrupt government officials, with no room for honest men like Juvenal himself to live. Now, for his trouble, Juvenal was, not surprisingly, exiled under the reign of the Emperor Domitian. So, that's it for Roman philosophy and letters. In part 3 of this lecture, we'll pick up with Rome's contributions to the performing and visual arts.